On the floor of a semiconductor fabrication plant in Chandler, Arizona, a single deposition tool costs more than a commercial airliner. Under legislation advancing through Congress right now, the company operating that fab may soon be barred from buying certain of those tools from Chinese suppliers for a full decade. That bar would not come from a trade sanction or an export control order. It would come from the grant agreement the fab signed when it accepted federal money to build on American soil in the first place. The pressure did not come from the export control side of the ledger. It came from the procurement side, from the subsidies, the conditions, and the binding commitments that brought these fabs to Chandler and Columbus and Taylor, Texas in the first place. Follow the chain. A subsidy becomes a condition becomes a blacklist reshapes who builds the world's next generation of chip-making equipment, and the exclusion that was written to protect American manufacturing may instead be accelerating the foreign industry it intended to contain. That chain runs through a single document each time: the federal grant agreement itself, first as an incentive, then as a compliance obligation, then as a procurement bar, then as a market signal that lands in Shenzhen and Shanghai. Congress passed the CHIPS and Science Act with a set of conditions attached to every dollar it distributed. Grant recipients accepted those conditions as a term of award. The statutory text and the Commerce Department Guardrail Rule published in 2023 are confirmed. Companies that took federal funding agreed to restrict their expansion of semiconductor capacity in countries of concern. Intel's Ohio and Oregon sites, the Taiwanese foundry's Arizona fabs, and Samsung's Texas complex all entered that framework. That is the first link, and it is confirmed. The second link is where the chain extends in a direction the original legislation did not travel. Bipartisan legislation called the Chip Equipment and Procurement Act, advancing in committee, would prohibit those same grant recipients from purchasing chip-making equipment manufactured in China or by entities of concern for 10 years from the date of their award. The legislation text and the congressional record on this are confirmed. What the original act governed on the output side, this extension governs on the input side. The CHIPS Act transforms from a manufacturing subsidy with export side restrictions into a document that also governs what subsidized fabs are allowed to buy. A production incentive acquires a procurement blacklist. The third link is where an abstraction becomes a number. Applied Materials, the largest semiconductor equipment supplier headquartered in the United States, disclosed that regulatory changes tied to this tightening environment will reduce its fiscal 2026 revenue by approximately $600 million. That figure is its stated direct exposure, and it comes from the company's own public earnings guidance and communications with its investors. That disclosure is confirmed. What it does to the broader market is worth tracking carefully. A named Western incumbent is already pricing in the constraint. Competitors update their vendor maps. Customers start asking which tools on their procurement lists are still available under the coming rules. The demand signal is no longer speculative. It has a dollar figure attached, and the figure belongs to the industry's most established Western supplier. One caution on that $600 million number is worth stating plainly. The figure is a disclosed estimate tied to regulatory changes broadly construed, not a line item attributed exclusively to the Chip Equipment and Procurement Act alone. Adjacent export control actions are contributing to the same revenue line. The Act's isolated impact is not cleanly separable from public disclosures alone, which means the number is real, but its attribution to any single policy is a reported inference rather than a carved-out accounting item. The chain does not depend on precision here. It depends on the direction, and the direction is confirmed. The fourth link is where the chain reaches into the equipment market itself. The explicit exclusion of Chinese manufactured tools from subsidized American fabs, covering a full 10-year grant horizon, removes a meaningful and growing customer base from the addressable market of Chinese equipment vendors at exactly the moment those vendors were beginning to move from trailing edge to mid-tier tool categories. Multiple industry analysts and trade publications have tracked this progression. The vendors affected are not confined to the lowest process nodes. They have been qualifying tools at progressively more demanding specifications, and the American subsidized fab market represented a potential customer base that gave those qualification cycles commercial weight. With that market now structurally off limits, the affected vendors face a fork in the road. One path is contraction toward the domestic Chinese fab market, which is large but bounded and already intensely competitive. The second path is an accelerated push to qualify their tools with fabs outside the CHIPS Act's jurisdictional reach, fabs in Southeast Asia, integrated device manufacturers in Europe, and emerging market producers that accepted no American federal conditions and carry no procurement restrictions. The acceleration toward that second path is reported in directional industry coverage. The scale and pace of it are inferred from the market structure the exclusion creates. Here's where the expectation turns over. The exclusion did not shrink the Chinese equipment industry's reach. It redirected it toward the part of the global market the CHIPS Act cannot touch, where qualification cycles are now running that would not have been prioritized otherwise. The vendors shut out of Chandler and Columbus now have a structural reason to prove their tools at fabs in Penang, Dresden, and Bangalore. If they succeed there, they arrive at the next generation of procurement decisions with a reference customer base they did not have when the restriction was written. That fifth link is the most consequential and the least nailed down. It follows from the market structure the exclusion creates, and it is consistent with prior episodes in semiconductor trade history, where a closed market forced an excluded supplier to prove itself elsewhere and returned later with stronger credentials. But it is an inference. There is no company-level confirmation of this strategic pivot at scale, no signed fab agreements outside China, no capital commitments traceable to a named toolmaker's public disclosures as of the current knowledge horizon. The chain holds on its confirmed lower rungs. What sits above them is a well-reasoned inference about how a structural market exclusion typically redirects investment, plausible and consistent with the pattern, but not yet on the record in specific form. The phrase doing the most work in the entire bill is entities of concern. That phrase decides which Chinese equipment vendors are actually excluded, and it leaves the implementing agency to draw the line after the law passes. Think of it as a zoning ordinance written before the neighborhood is surveyed. The law draws the boundary, but the agency has to walk the actual parcels afterward and decide which addresses fall inside the restricted zone. Until that survey is complete, every supplier on the boundary operates under uncertainty, and so does every buyer who depends on them. If the rulemaking carves out joint ventures, technology licensed subsidiaries, or tools manufactured in third countries with Chinese origin components, the blacklist shrinks substantially. The demand destruction effect in the fourth link becomes proportionally smaller. The acceleration effect in the fifth link loses some of its forcing pressure. The single link the whole chain hangs on is the enforceability and scope of that phrase, because it decides how wide the exclusion actually is before any downstream effect can be measured. A narrow definition produces a narrow blacklist and a modest redirection. A broad definition produces a sweeping exclusion and a powerful forcing mechanism pushing Chinese toolmakers toward global qualification at speed. That rulemaking has not been finalized, the legislation has not been enacted. The uncertainty is real, and the chain's upper links are contingent on how that phrase gets defined in the regulatory process that follows passage. Follow the full sequence from the beginning, and the destination is a place the original drafters did not advertise. A 10-year procurement bar on Chinese equipment inside American subsidized fabs may be the most concrete industrial policy decision the United States has made in this cycle, not because of what it builds inside those fabs, but because of what it removes from the vendor landscape and where those vendors go next. The CHIPS Act set out to anchor manufacturing on American soil. The Chip Equipment and Procurement Act turns that anchor into a filter. What passes through the filter and what it forces to find another port will determine whether the next decade of equipment development runs through American supply chains or around them. The grant agreement remains the anchor of this chain throughout. It begins as an incentive, becomes a compliance condition, acquires a procurement bar, and lands as a market signal on the other side of the world. Each of those transformations passes through the same document signed in Chandler and Columbus and Taylor. The subsidy drew the fabs home. The blacklist is drawing the map of who gets to supply them. That second map may matter more than the first. Watch the next 18 months of fab equipment qualification announcements outside the United States. If Chinese toolmakers begin appearing on the approved vendor lists of major fabs not covered by CHIPS Act conditions, at mid-tier process nodes, the chain confirmed itself. If they remain confined to domestic Chinese customers, the restriction held the line it intended to draw. That outcome is not yet visible. It is the next observable link in a chain that is still being written. If you track where semiconductor supply chains are actually being redrawn, not where the press releases say they are, subscribe. This channel follows the chain.